To start with a general question, Susan, the state the country is in, what does it do to you? Does it make you sad? Does it make you angry? Does it make you desperate, maybe?
Well, thank you. It's a good question. Every day, really, since Election Day 2016, especially for someone like me who spent the vast majority of my career over the last several decades here in Washington, there are almost many mornings in any week when you wake up and you say, like, is this real? Is this really happening? And so I do think the sense of disbelief remains palpable even now, almost a full 4 years into Donald Trump's presidency, combined perhaps with the sense of, constantly rising blood pressure. And I do think, for a journalist whose self-assigned role is to watch this unfold every week, and I chronicle that in my New Yorker letter from Washington, I find that I almost have to psych myself up to be emotionally ready to deal with, whatever that week's craziness and disruption is going to be. And of course, understandably, many people whose job it is not to write about this, they look away, they can't bear to sort of pay attention. And I don't mean that in an ideological sense. It's so stressful and disruptive to see this happening in your country, a series of what you thought were unthinkable things. But for me in particular, I do think there's still many mornings that I wake up and I think, is this really happening?
And can you describe to us, what is it that surprises you still, or that surprises you most, or what still shocks you? And after 3.5 years, you or the world could be used to it, but I'm not either. But
right.
In your words.
Well, I do think that one of the challenges, in fact, is how do you keep your sense and preserve your sense of disbelief and of, if not surprise at this point at least, of shock at those things which are genuinely shocking. It is not a surprise at this moment in time to hear the President of the United States use some of the language that he does to call his opponents human scum, for example, which is the language of totalitarians. It's the language of dehumanization and dictators. It's not the language of American presidents. He's used it many times, so you can't be surprised, but it is actually shocking. And so maintaining your ability to be discomfited and uncertain and uncomfortable and upset by this, I think is really, it's harder and harder to do after 4 years, but I think it's a very important part of the project. And so you'll hear a lot of journalists debate each time Trump gives a particularly inflammatory press conference or rally or tweet. You'll hear this debate crop up again and again. Well, should we pay attention to him? Aren't we just, giving him what he wants, which is airtime? I am pretty firmly in the camp that, if the President of the United States is going to say these things, then we need to listen. And some of that comes out of my experience, really, as a correspondent in Moscow, and understanding that when you have a situation with a would-be authoritarian leader, as Vladimir Putin was even at the beginning of his tenure, it behooves you to listen to what he says, because often that proves to be much more accurate about what's actually going to happen than the sycophantic or misleading words of those who surround the leader. And I think that's been true with Donald Trump as well.
Do you think he's, talking about Donald Trump, he's still being underestimated because so many people don't take it seriously? They still think, well, he's just playing with words, or maybe he's a little rough, but he's not really a totalitarian?
Well, here's what I would say. Someone can both be a buffoon and very, very dangerous. It's not for us to judge the end results yet, because we're still in the middle of the story. I would say that the people who said early on, don't pay attention to the tweets, were wrong. And they have been proven to be wrong. And those tweets signaled actions, and often they were much more reliable as a signal and a real-time source of information into what the President of the United States actually thinks, regardless, again, of what the sort of sycophants and liars who surround him have to say. So I'm sure that the German government and others did not ignore the tweets. If they did, they would have been wrong to do so. So I can't say what's in Donald Trump's head, what's in his heart. I don't need to. There's a pretty voluminous record that suggests that this is a man who has no filter and is going to tell us a lot of what he's thinking at any given moment.
Would you say that norms and rules, democratic norms, democratic rules, have been destroyed, or is it all reversible?
Well, that's a good question. Here in Washington, almost from the very beginning of the Trump presidency, you had many people, independent observers as well as Democrats, saying essentially America can survive 4 years of Donald Trump, but not 8 years. And I remember very vividly this conversation beginning immediately in the winter of 2017. We'll see. I think one expectation that really has been proven a bit wrong back in the beginning of 2017 was the idea that our institutions were strong and resilient enough and would resist Trump more. If anything, I think one thing we've found out over the subsequent time is that so much of what we thought of as the institution of the American presidency is not enshrined in law, but in fact is the result of the push and pull inside our political system, and is the result of norms rather than rules and regulations. And there have been those who have been willing to accommodate Trump as he has shredded many norms that we might have thought were previously sacrosanct. And remember, demagoguery is a tactic. It's not a strategy. It can be deployed by someone on the left as well as someone on the right in the future. And many of the power grabs of what we call the increasingly imperial presidency in the United States have taken place over the last several decades and have been supported and cheered on by presidents of both parties, all of whom tend to want to maximize their power and not see official constraints on it enshrined into law. For example, many Democratic presidents, and I mean Democrat as in the Democratic Party, you can envision them not wanting to give the press the access in the same way that Trump has sort of systematically undone a lot of the freedom of information traditions and access to basic facts that used to exist in previous administrations. When
you think about the debate about terms like fascism, or is this the end of the American democracy, where do you stand there? Would you say fascism is just too much, or let's just not get into this because this is of course dangerous territory? What's your standpoint there?
I think that we have enough of a crisis here in the United States that I'm not that interested in spending a lot of time fighting with other observers about the labeling of it. And, I do remember when our friend Bob Kagan wrote the first piece in the Washington Post in the spring of 2016. He wrote a column, I think for the first time, by someone, in a place like the Washington Post, comparing Trump and what was happening in the United States to the 1930s in your country. And it was seen as absolutely inflammatory and provocative and completely, out of bounds at that time. And of course, in the end, a lot of what he wrote then ended up seeming not crazy, but prescient.
Mm-hmm. Which leads to the thought, well, something has changed. There are books coming out. There was Robert Reich's tweet, I think, where he said, well, for 3.5 years he didn't want to use the word fascism, but not the F word, he said. But now, after so many attacks on the press and so much twisting of American foundations, the courts, he has to change his mind.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What I would say more is that, you know, I think it's been a very painful few years for those who had a notion about American exceptionalism and, you know, the unique strengths and history of our democracy, as if we were made of different human material than that in other countries. And for me, I do think that, you know, it's a powerful and unsettling experience of realizing that the previously unthinkable can happen here. In that sense, there's a strong echo from the accounts that we read of the 1930s or of any other society where democracy has suffered serious blows. And I don't think it's an accident that it was many of my friends and colleagues and observers and experts who I knew from Russia and the former Soviet Union who were the most alarmed in the course of 2016 by the rise of Trump, not just because of the very explicit issue of Russian election interference, which was causing especially many of those inside the Obama administration to try to raise the alarms internally, and you know how that turned out. They were not really successful, I think, in getting the attention of President Obama and Secretary Kerry at a time when it could have made more of a difference, perhaps. But it wasn't just that. So there was the narrow issue of election interference, but then there was also, I think, just the visceral experience of understanding the language of authoritarianism and how unusual it was to be deployed in this domestic political context here in the United States. I've seen sharp divisions before in the country. You know, you can't forget about what it was like here when George W. Bush invaded Iraq and things went so badly awry in the Middle East. That was a very partisan time. You can't read about the 1960s and the Vietnam War. You can't think about McCarthyism in the United States or the long and terrible tradition of racial demagoguery and not think, well, you know, this isn't brand new in American society, but it is brand new to have the President of the United States espousing these views from the perch of the most powerful office in the land.
Do you think the media, I don't know if it's too much of a generalization, made a mistake in 2016 or 2015 leading to 2016? Did they, in a way, create Donald Trump? I'm sure you've heard this thesis before. Do you agree? Have they? If they've made a mistake, what would it be?
Well, look, Donald Trump, you know, essentially is the most media-focused presidency of any of our lifetimes. And, you know, many presidents are media obsessed, so this is really saying something. Yeah. He seems to spend almost all day, or to define his job almost exclusively in terms of watching, processing, engaging with media, and finding a way to be covered and to be a central actor in it. In 2015 and 2016, I think that the television coverage in particular helped to fuel his rise, and there certainly was a different tone and nature to that early television coverage of Trump as a showman, as almost a reality TV show type presidency or presidential campaign. You know, I think that is obviously no longer the case and has not been for quite a long time, but I do think that that's something that we can look back on and say perhaps it facilitated his rise. But I have a different perspective. My view is that you know, Donald Trump has also been covered more aggressively than perhaps any certainly non-politician presidential candidate of our lifetime. There were 5 major investigative biographies of him written before he ever entered politics, you know, and obviously lots of great accountability journalism and investigative reporting both during the campaign and subsequently. So can you really say that Americans went to the polls in November of 2016 and didn't know who Donald Trump was? You can say that perhaps they didn't pay enough attention to aspects of it. And for me as a journalist, I think that's where the crisis of journalism connected with Trump comes in. You know, we have a view essentially that it's not our role. We're not partisan, we're independent. Our job is to pick up the rock and show you all the creepy crawly things underneath. And then the voters are supposed to do the right thing with that information. And I think what you saw here is a feeling that perhaps the accountability that is supposed to go with accountability journalism has never come for Donald Trump. And of course, in many ways, that's the theme of his career. He's a man who has never really been held accountable for almost anything.
What has become of the ability to actually well, find out what's true and then argue? That's what a grown-up democracy should be able to do. What has changed? Why has it happened? Why have facts become disputed and not arguments? But arguments should be disputed, and positions, but not the actual facts. Mm-hmm. What went wrong there? Why differently put, why the disdain for science and numbers?
Yeah. So Donald Trump did not invent the Republican Party's disdain for science, for numbers. Look at the history of climate change denialism over the last decade or so inside the Republican Party. He, however, as a politician, is uniquely suited to emphasize that and to make war on it even more so. And so in fact, actually, George W. Bush, had this sort of original sin of his presidency in this invasion of Iraq on arguably false pretenses, but at the same time tried to, although he did not succeed, to cut a deal with Democrats on immigration, for example, was not overtly hostile to the environment. Certainly his father, George H.W. Bush, was actually an environmentalist. So this is something that you can say is a post-Cold War phenomenon of the American right, or aspects of the American right. It just so happens that Donald Trump is a uniquely fact-free persona, and this of course long predates his history in American politics. He was always a public liar, a showman, an exaggerator, a fabricator, and in his business career it got him in trouble many times, and this is a man with multiple bankruptcies, but of course the stakes are very different. It's just one man's business career versus an entire country or world's environment on the line. And so I just think that this strand of republicanism already existed, but you can't think of anybody who would be more likely to emphasize that as a specific aspect of his politics than Donald Trump, who not only has this incredible history of lying and fabricating, but also seems to have a huge challenge actually processing and retaining information. So even if he were so inclined, might have a real difficulty proceeding with evidence-based, fact-based decision-making.
I understand how you explained Donald Trump and the Republican Party, but society in general, why does it fall for it? Why the disdain for science? For example, if you look at COVID-19, climate change is more difficult. It's so far in the future. Yeah. But if you look at COVID-19, it's so easy to understand what it does and how to behave. It's not difficult at all.
It's not brain surgery.
But why is it here?
No, it's not brain surgery. Although I will say that, stupidity is not a uniquely American phenomenon either. And, like lots of people at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, went back and reread the accounts of the 1918 flu, or, for that matter, the, 1666 plague in Britain, or the, earlier incidents of the plague. And, the commonalities of human stupidity in such a situation are enormous. And there was both widespread mask adaptation in 1918, and there were political backlashes against it. As my son Theo often points out to me, you know, one response to the plague, and again, this was in not the medieval plague, but in, you know, the sort of post-Renaissance plague in Britain, was the rise of flagellants, you know, around, who were beating themselves as if this would stop this epidemic. You know, there's so many examples in which America's poor response to the coronavirus is very consistent with history across time of how humans have denied science or even the rational things to do. Now, what makes it more painful is that we are living in a more scientific and fact-based age in which technocratic, smart government has been able to dramatically mitigate the effects that might have been felt in a previous era, the loss of life and the suffering. Obviously, we do have many more abilities to act against a disease like this than we might have previously. And so I think that's the tragedy. Right on the eve of the pandemic, there was a group that undertook a study of all the major countries in the world to see which would be the most prepared to handle an outbreak like this. And of course, the United States rated #1 in the world, and that study, I believe, came out in February of 2020.
And can you explain why the society in general, of course, I know there's plenty of different, very intelligent people here, but that's why I wonder why the society in general reacts that way. We're in 2020, we're not in the age of the plague, we're even 100 years further compared to the Spanish flu. There are people like Dr. Fauci in Germany. The Dr. Fauci is called Christian Drosten. That's the German epidemiologist's, the #1 epidemiologist's name. And the society is listening to him. Yeah. They have listened to him, and he's been advising Chancellor Merkel. And Germany has made a couple of mistakes. Of course they have. They have opened a couple of how do you call this, meat industry complexes,
yeah.
meatpacking complexes too early, and big mistake there. And then there was an infection in one city, which was terrible, infection rate, which was terrible. But in general, the society has believed in science and learned from the data and behaved responsibly.
Yeah.
Why not here? I'm trying to understand why.
Well, I mean, you can say on the one hand, actually, there has been a striking bipartisan view, especially if you look at the surveys early on, that Americans did trust Dr. Fauci, and they did trust public health expertise in their doctors. The one group in society, if you looked at those numbers, especially in the spring, in March and April, when this first started, the one group in society that was less trustful were self-identified Republicans, and they said that they were going to get their health information from Donald Trump. And as astonishing as that might be, Donald Trump abused their trust all over again and essentially politicized the wearing of masks, politicized the question of decision-making around what kind of lockdowns were needed or what kind of public health measures were required. And those voters, who are not at all a majority of Americans, by the way, took their cue from Trump. But remember, a majority of Americans actually do believe in the science here. A majority, a strong majority, close to 2/3 of Americans, as you and I are having this conversation, disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And more than 2/3 of Americans say they do trust Dr. Fauci and our public health experts. So, I think it's right to condemn many Americans for their own responsibility in failing to take this pandemic seriously or to take responsibility for their own actions. But I think it's more right to say that it's been a massive leadership failure, because you look and you say that there's nothing inherently that made a very bipartisan, huge majority of Americans willing to believe at the beginning what the experts were saying. They were abused.
Mm-hmm.